The March on Washington was one of the most influential gatherings for civil rights in U.S. history.
Slavery ended in 1865 after the 13th Amendment was added to the Constitution and a series of laws were added to give blacks rights. However, racism still remained. In the mid-1900s, the topic of African American rights was aroused again. On August 28, 1963, the March on Washington took place in Washington, D.C. at the Lincoln Memorial. Because of the massive 250,000 people participating in the march, the government noticed how important equality and civil rights are to people. It's the government's responsibility to listen to its citizens. The importance of civil rights to other races is more than it is for Caucasians. Voting is one of the major rights that were excluded from African Americans and other races. Voting impacts our country by having citizens to choose the president and other leaders. The change in the country depends on what the leaders do.
Even before the March on Washington, Black Americans had been working on making a change in civil rights since before the Civil War. In 1865, the Civil War ended and the 13th Amendment was made that banned slavery. In the Supreme Court case Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896, the Supreme Court ruled that it was legal to have separate but equal facilities for black, colored, and whites. Blacks could only be legally forbidden from using things labeled whites only. Malcolm X thought that the March on Washington wouldn't solve most of the problems for black people. At one point in time, the government had a poll on African American rights. A poll is a voting for something. To enter these polls, however, required a test to see if you were qualified. Many African Americans lived in the South and had little education because of their environment. Because of this, they were unable to enter these polls and share their feelings. Prior to the march, White House officials warned organizers such a march could create a conservative backlash against the movement. Adjustments occurred at the march's site, shifted from the White House to the Lincoln Memorial. Organizers also agreed to censor militant speakers.
On August 28, 1963, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. led the March on Washington, located at the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. It was a march to bring the nation together. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was the person who gave the famous "I Have a Dream" speech that became one of the most famous speeches of all time. Quote, "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day, where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character," unquote, was a quote from his speech, and it touched the hearts of hundreds of thousands of people. There were also many other African American figures, such as Malcolm X, Whitney Young Jr., Roy Wilkins, and James Farmer.
Even after the March on Washington, racial discrimination still remained. People continued fighting for what they believed in. There were many more speeches and many more protests before the government changed. Eventually, racial discrimination was removed and changed within the law to create equal rights. However, within communities, racism still remained. Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. was recently memorialized in Washington, D.C. because he helped greatly in the civil rights movement and was able to be remembered for the generations to come.
The assassination of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. took place on April 4, 1968. Though he was dead, what he fought for is still being fought for. Racial discrimination still remains to this day, even after gathering over 250,000 people who were wanting change, a change for the world around them, the right to be equal and live life for what they deserve and have earned.